Good evening, brothers and sisters. My name is Carl C. Nichols. I'm the distributor of the African Heritage Bible in New York and New Jersey. Yesterday, a friend of mine by the name of Reverend Clemson Brown introduced me to Dr. Anthony Andow of Ghana. And we decided to have a meeting and discuss the advantages of this Bible over the Eurocentric Bible. So what I'm here to do today is to present this Bible in essence for its benefits to our people over the Bible we have used for the last 300 or 400 years. The original African Heritage Bible was published by Winston Derrick of Nashville, Tennessee, and it was edited. The general editor was Kane Hope Felder. The associate editor was Dr. People. When I brought this book to New York, at first I had a lot of resistance from the preachers because the preachers were afraid to show this Bible. So I used the tactic of developing a brochure that would soften the preachers and let them know that I was a historian and a scholar. The brochure that I developed is called A Short History of the English Bible. This is what it looked like. It is 4 pages, but it covers 3,245 years of the evolution of the English Bible, from Africa to the present Bible in Nashville, Tennessee. I asked some of the preachers who had followings, could they bring together 5, 10, 15, 20 preachers so I could start lecturing on this Bible. And when I got an audience at HCCI, I began a series of 3 lectures. The first lecture had to do with the origin of the Bible. So if we look on page 2, we'll see the African ethnic origin and development of the English Bible. We'll find out that the first 5 languages the Bible was written in its original manuscripts were all African languages. They are Ge'ez, Egyptian, Amharic, Phoenician Hebrew, and Aramaic. All of those languages are African languages. Aramaic, when it's written, it's called Syriac. So if I use the name interchangeable between Aramaic and Syriac, I'm speaking of the same book. The Bible was translated 1,000 years after it was written from the Old Testament for the first time into the European language of Greek. The Greeks were the first whites to come in contact with the Africans in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nubia. And at that time, they were still barbaric and they came to learn. We must understand that Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia were the citadel of world learning during those days. So when the Greeks were first coming down, they were coming down as students to learn. What they were amazed at is when they saw the original manuscripts that were written, they wanted to have them translated so they could take them back to Europe. So what we tried to do is give you an understanding of the first 5 languages that the Bible was written in. The Greeks on stage B wrote a version called the Septuagint version in the year 285 BC. And it was translated from that time from Hebrew to Syriac to Greek. Okay? The next translation of the Bible was number C, was the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Hebrew to Samaritan was the Pentateuch. The Samaritan is also an African language. The next copy was the earliest translated from Hebrew to Syriac to Greek. And that was early copies, Codex Sinaiticus, AD 330. The last and final translation from a foreign language to a European tongue was into Latin. The Latin was the Vulgate. Vulgate came about around 400 AD when right about the name of Jerome went to Jerusalem to translate the whole Bible and all of the manuscripts into Latin. So Latin, the Bible became Latin 400 AD, 400 years after Christ. From the time of Christ, from the time of the Vulgate all the way up to 1611, the Bible was all in Catholic Latin all over Western Europe and Northern Europe. The English began to make a struggle against the Catholic lords of the church from the year 1380 to 1611 for a Protestant Bible. So in this brochure, what I have is number 1, Wycliffe Incomplete, from 1380 to 1525. The next attempt at an English Bible was a Coverdale, number 3 in 1535. The next attempt was Matthew's at the Matthew's Bible in 1537. The next attempt at an English Bible was the Great Bible of 1539. The next attempt was the Geneva Bible of 1560. The seventh attempt was the Bishop Bible of 1568. In order for the Catholics to keep people from protesting and becoming Protestant, they wrote their second revision called the Reims d'Oyer. The Reims d'Oyer was written in 1610, 1 year after King James wrote and completed the first English Protestant Bible. It was written by 47 scholars and translated into English, and that became the first English Protestant Bible. Now, what is the connection between my Bible and that Bible? Our Bible is also King James, except it's done from an Afrocentric point of view. What King James left out, the African presence in the Bible, and what King James translated and mistranslated, we have corrected. So the original African Heritage Bible is a correction of the King James Bible, brought up to date where the characters are represented as Africans, which they were in the beginning. Now, if we want to look at this Bible, we have some pictures here to show you 3 maps of what Africa used to be. Prior to the building of the Suez Canal in 1859, everything below that green line was Africa. Okay? The land mass in ancient times below the green line. That went across the Mediterranean, up through the Bosphorus, into the Black Sea, and down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into the Persian Gulf. That was Africa of the ancient world. Map number 2 will show Africa Eden, where we see it today, after the completion of the Suez Canal. After the Suez Canal was completed, Africa lost several countries. It lost Saudi Arabia, it lost Iraq, it lost Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. All of those used to be parts of Africa. So when we look at the third map here, we show you the part of Africa, this area here that was lost and was transferred to Southeast Asia, or Asia Minor, or the Middle East. This all occurred after 1869, the completion of the Suez Canal. These maps are very important because these maps show you what we're talking about when we say Jesus and Moses and Joshua were Africans. We can show you that date of birth, their place of birth, and where it was located on the map. So what we are saying is we are not doing this Bible to be mean-spirited toward whites. We are putting history in its proper perspective by giving you the truth as history reveals it. Okay? So right now, we're saying to all people of African descent and Europeans of good intention that this Bible will give us back all of the knowledge that we lost during the slave trade. And it should be in every black home in the world, not only in America, because it gives us back the history that was falsified, whitewashed, destroyed, and lost deliberately. To put history to Scripture, we know that all our preachers know the Scripture, but most of them don't know the time and date and when these events took place. And it is important to put history to Bible, because by putting history to it, it gives us our history, and it gives it to us in a way that we can utilize it for our own liberation. If we can use the Bible for power to liberate us, the same Eurocentric Bible that enslaved us, the Afrocentric Bible can liberate our minds. Once our minds are liberated, then we can develop the type of consciousness we need to go into the 21st century. However, I think that in order for us to go into the 21st century, we'll have to develop 7 forms of consciousness. We have to develop a land consciousness, a labor consciousness, a national consciousness, a race consciousness, a class consciousness, a caste consciousness, and a gender consciousness. If we develop those 7 forms of consciousness, we'll be well on our way to liberating our mind, liberating our body, and taking humanity into the 21st century like the Lord Almighty wanted us to do.
The condition of African people today makes it hard to believe that African people have always had a very special relationship with God, that they were in fact the chosen people, the ones in whom God would choose to bless the entire world. Their story, however, can be parallel to the story of Job in the Bible. Job was a righteous man whom God loved and who loved God. God so loved, respected, and trusted Job that he made Job the standard by which man's perfect devotion to God would be measured. Job, a perfect and upright man, was blessed above all other men. So blessed was Job that other men came to him for his wisdom, his wealth, and his leadership. The Bible says that there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said,
From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it.
And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou not considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man that feareth God and eschews evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said,
Doth Job fear God for naught? Hath not thou made a hedge about him and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the works of his hands, and his substance increaseth in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face.
And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he has is in thy power. The story of Job is that the elect of God must always stand the test of time. In essence, this is an examination by God of one's soul, which is not always exposed when everything is going well. One must be ready to bear the burdens of salvation and freedom under all circumstances in order to serve God. Like Job, African people have undergone a total examination of their soul. It is as if God removed all protection from them and said unto Satan, All that they have is in thy power. This once great, wealthy, noble, and mighty people have seen their wealth, their honor, their dignity, and their humanity forcibly ripped from them, just like Job. This is their story, the story of African people. Let us begin in the beginning.
And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. And the Lord God planted a garden east in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from hence it was parted and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison, that is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah. And there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. And the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth towards the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates.
Let me have that pencil. On this map here, the four rivers that referred to in Genesis is called the White Nile. It started at the Great Lakes area, right here, and runs 4,152 miles to the Sea of Egypt, or the Mediterranean. The Blue Nile started at Addis Ababa in the province, I think, of Gondor, and it runs 937 miles to where it meets the White Nile at Khartoum. And then they journey together through all seven of the cataracts and dump into the Mediterranean. The other two rivers of the Bible is the Tigris, which run from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, and the Euphrates that run from somewhere in northern Turkey to the Persian Gulf. Between these four rivers was called the heart of the Garden of Eden. So when we look at this map, we see Africa. But the African name for Africa was Al-Kebulan. Al-Kebulan, when translated from the Ethiopian, which we call Geese or Amharic, and the Egyptian, is called Eden. So Eden simply means the cradle of mankind, the mother of civilization, or the Garden of Eden.
To give an overview, beginning in Genesis, to talk about the Genesis. Of course, we know the Bible begins with the Genesis. So I want you to begin with that.
Okay. As we know the Old Testament, the Bible began with Genesis. But before Genesis, a great prophet by the name of Enoch existed. He lived 1,000 years before Moses. In fact, he was the seventh seed of Adam. Adam had two boys, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel, and the Bible don't tell us why. But when we begin to look in other books, we begin to find out that Cain and Abel had two sisters, and it was a fight over the love of one sister. The sister's name was Luluawa. Then we begin to see that Adam had a third son named Seth, and we know the Hebrew people through the seed of Seth. Adam had Seth, Seth had Enos, Enos had Canaan, Canaan had Mahalalel, Mahalalel had Jared, and Jared had Enoch. Enoch is he who was told that walked with God. Now Enoch wrote a book called the first book of Adam and Eve, the second book of Adam and Eve, which Moses came about later, 1,000 years later, and rewrote Genesis from. So when we look at Genesis, in order to get and understand Genesis completely, we have another book called the Lost Books of the Bible and the Forgotten Books of Eden that defines what all of these books are that were left out of the original Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, a lot of these books were left out because they could not be canonized. Canonized meaning that the founding fathers of the Catholic Church had to look through them and legitimatize them and make them legal. Some of the books that should have been made legal, like the first book of Adam and Eve and the second book of Adam and Eve, was not made legitimate because it included some incest. The two brothers had no other women on earth, and they married their sisters. The Catholic Church couldn't find no reason to say that that was legal because incest existed. But if we want to know the truth, we have to know that Cain slew Abel over his sister, and the human race was to go on through that. Because if there was only two people on earth, Adam and Eve had only two boys, then the generation of humanity couldn't have continued unless the boys killed the father to have the mother. So what we have to do is see that they used their sister, which was incest, but it carried on what we call the seed of Seth. All of that can be seen in the lost books of the Bible and the forgotten book of Eden. This book right here. In soft cover, it's only $9.95. But everything that's left out of your Bible, everything that's left out of the New and Old Testament that's of importance is in this book. Another book that's important for all of us to read is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The reason for that, if you're going to be truly a historical or Bible scholar, you have to know what time and place the Bible what time and events that the Bible took place in. And you have to know that there were 5 books in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were uncovered in 1947 that were never put in the Bible. The name of those books is Enoch, Sirach, Jubilee, Levi, and Tobit. Now, when we open up the book of Enoch, we find out that the whole book had been written in Ethiopic, which we call classic Ethiopic Geese. Now, that would mean that Geese existed before Hebrew and was probably the language that the early Ethiopians that went into Egypt spoke, way before Egyptian, way before Hebrew. So when they decipher this book today, what they find out is in order to decipher it, they have to get Ethiopian translators that were still fluent in Geese. If we read the book of Enoch turned all Western history upside down, because the book of Enoch shows that Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah. And if Enoch was the great-great-grandfather of Noah, and he was jet black and an Ethiopian and only spoke Geese, then Noah had to be an Ethiopian too. And if Noah had to be an Ethiopian too, how could he have three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and one be white, and one be yellow, and one be black? It is a farce. So we have to put religion and history in its proper perspective by learning how to separate the myth from the history. Although there's some myth in all religions, there is a lot of history that can go into it that will make everything more important for us to understand. For example, there are 10 major religions in the world. All 10 of them are rooted in Egypt. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is the mother of every known religion to man that's accepted. It is the mother of Christianity, it's the mother of Hebrew, it's the mother of Islam, it's the mother of Zoroastrianism, it's the mother of Hinduism, it's the mother of Buddhism, it's the mother of Shintoism, it's the mother of Laotiism, and it's the mother of Confucianism. Now each of these other Bibles that I'm talking about have names. Some of them, the Quran is the Bible of the Muslim. The Old Testament or the Torah is the Bible of the Hebrew. When we get all the way down to the Hindu, we find out that their Bible is called the Bhagavad Gita. But all of these men that formed these religions in the 5th and 6th century before Christ studied at the feet of the Egyptian priests in Egypt. When Cyrus of Persia invaded the temples of Egypt, these men went home and formed their own religion. So one of the things that has befuddled scholars for years is why between the 5th and 6th century BC, so many religions appear in different parts of the world. What we came to the conclusion of is that at that time, the temples were being raided at Luxor, at Thebes, the temples of Karnak, and the scholars had to run home for their life. And once they got home, they began to found new religion that was accepted by the people. This can be proved and documented, and it started from 550 BC to 526 BC. It's a span of 24 years that all of these religions came into being. Now, there are 7 concepts of God in these religions. Now, I'm saying to you it's 10 different religions and it's 7 concepts of God. Here are the 7 concepts of God. The 7 concepts of God is monotheism, one God; polytheism, 2 gods; theism, personal God; deism, people that believe in God but no church; agnosticism, I don't know; atheism, no God; and pantheism, God in nature is one. Most of us that study African religions and spirituality know that nature and God is almost synonymous. So what we are saying to everybody is we must learn to unlock nature's secrets in order to see God. God, as we've been taught in the Western world, as an individual is much larger than an individual. God is nature itself in its essence. And if we can understand nature's laws of dualism, evolution, centrifugal force, dissolution, then we begin to know who God is and can feel and touch it. So the reason I touched on that is because this Bible for the first time, the original African Heritage Bible for the first time, opens up all avenues for exploration for religion, for theology, for history, for economics, for politics, for the social order, and for the liberation not only of black people, but of mankind. Okay?
Now, Brother Nichols, you are making some very serious statements, and let me clarify some point here. Are you saying that Adam and Eve had more than 2 children?
I'm saying that Adam and Eve had 5 children. 5 children?
But we're told they only had 2 children. Are they in the books? Are they in this Bible here?
They're not in this Bible, they're in this Bible. But what we are saying is this Bible has to supplement this Bible, because this is our first attempt. And our first attempt wasn't to turn too many people away. A lot of times when you tell the people the whole truth at one time, they can't take it. But if you can give it to them a little bit at a time, they can digest it. So what we are saying is in conjunction with this Bible, if we would read some of the lost books of the Bible that were never put in this Bible. See, this is the King James Bible. We didn't change a thing in here. All we did is reinterpreted everything in here. Because if you change it, a lot of people that believe in King James will look at it. So you have a King James intact. The interpretation is different in that it is interpreted from an Afrocentric point of view. Everything else is the same. The representation has been changed. The translation and interpretation has been changed. But we did not add other books and we did not take out any book. But the books that should have been included that were not sanctioned by the Catholic Church are in this book.
Good.
This is called the Lost Book of the Bible and the Forgotten Books of Eden. Now you notice the name Eden, and I told you earlier that Eden was called, that Africa was called Eden.
For Adam, and that there were many books. Can you comment on that?
Well, we know Enoch basically through the book of Genesis. Now Moses and his brother Aaron wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. In Greek they call it the Pentateuch, in Hebrew they call it the Torah. The first 5 books I'm speaking of is Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. Okay, Enoch is the 7th character in the Bible from Adam's seed. Now if Moses wrote about Enoch, it means that Enoch came before Moses. You cannot write about people that come behind you. You can only write about people that come before you. So when Moses wrote of Enoch, Moses wrote of Enoch as the one who walked with God. He was the first man in the Old Testament that ascended into heaven. Ascending come from Egyptian mythology that says that when a man is one with God and he's so righteous and he's sin-free, gravity cannot hold him on the earth. In Egyptian society, Osiris was the first one to ascend. But in the Hebrew scripture, they had 2 men to ascend. One was called Enoch, and the other one was Elijah. The Christians had 1 man to ascend. His name was Jesus. Now, ascension is related to the Ethiopian and Egyptian mythology of being pure with God, one with nature, so righteous and free of sin that gravity cannot hold you back. You're so light, you're lighter than a feather, that anytime the wish of nature wants you, you leave. So ascension is the highest honor that you could pay to an Egyptian priest, is to say he ascended. He ascended meant that he was one with God, he became one with nature, he's one with the eternal spirit forever. But he meant he was so light that the gravitational pull of the earth could no longer hold him.
This concept is further explained by Dr. Leonard Jeffries, chairman of the Black Studies Department at the City University of New York. It is important to note that this concept existed in Nubia and Egypt more than 1,000 years before Abraham was born.
The Pharaoh, his great queen, the priests, the priestess, the nobles, the warriors, the ordinary people were subject to this process. That there would be a final judgment as the heart is weighed against the feather of truth. So this scene is from the Papyrus of Ani, which is found in the British Museum. And it shows us that Ani has come into the great hall of judgment, and he kneels before the judges, and these judges provide for us. Oh, show me again. The judges at the top of this illustration. There is an image of Ani kneeling before the judges. And each judge has a symbol of significance. But the judges represent the Supreme Court process that America now has in place as their major arbiters of what is the law and what is not the law. And so Ani kneels before them and acknowledges that he comes in the name of truth. And the symbol of truth, the Ankh, is held by many of the judges, because this is what we're trying to fathom. whether one lived a good life and lived at the standards of God, or whether one did not. So Ani is ushered in the next illustration into the judgment hall by the symbol of perception. Perception beyond the human perception. The perception symbolized by the God figure attribute Anubis, the jackal-headed figure. Now this does not represent, from what we can understand, Africans worshiping animals. But the principle that is found in the jackal is what is highlighted here. The jackal has this sixth sense beyond the ability of sight and smell. The jackal has a sixth sense of being able to take meat and bury it and be able to come back and retrieve the meat before it becomes rotten and poisonous and be able to sustain itself. So this sixth sense attribute of the jackal is being brought into this picture through what can be called a scale of justice. And the heart of Ani is being weighed against the feather of truth. And you need a deeper than human sense attribute to find out whether one is confessing that one has not sinned. And before these judges, one confesses around the 42 declarations of innocence. And this 42 declarations of innocence later becomes the basis that Moses and others used to raise up and to articulate and to prevent and reveal through the Ten Commandments. So the 42 declarations of innocence reads thus: I have not sinned against the gods. I have not harmed the children. I have not poisoned the water course. I have not committed adultery. I have not coveted another man's wife. I have not coveted another man's fields. A very complex system of values is projected in this scene in which the judges are being greeted by Ani, and which Ani is being ushered into the hall to judge whether he has actually been favorably balanced against these truths that the Ma'atian feather represents. Now, as Ani confesses his innocence against the 42 laws or standards of conduct and attributes, these elements and events are being recorded by Thoth or Tahuti, the ibis-headed figure. And of course, the ibis or ibis is considered very neat and proper in its conduct, and so as the record is being recorded, it is being recorded by the scribe, by Tahuti, very neat and proper. And Tahuti becomes also the symbol. Thoth is also a name that's used. Tahuti is closer to the African name, and Tahuti becomes the person who symbolizes the word and the standards that the word represents, the values that the word represents. So here is basic philosophical understanding. Scale of justice. Of course, outside of the Supreme Court of the United States, you have a scale of justice which is blindfolded, but that's a reinterpretation by the Europeans. Africans have another idea, that you need a sixth sense to really understand the truth, and you need to have it properly recorded. So you need to have your eyes doubly open and another sense to appreciate it. But again, judgment hall, final judgment, laws and standards, 42 declarations of innocence or commandments, as opposed to the 10. And then, as Ani passes muster, and he continues to move on to the judgment hall, he's being ushered into the presence of God by the Son of God. And again, you have the hawk-headed figure, which again represents an attribute of God. It's not worship of the hawk, or worship of the ibis bird, or worship of the jackal, but the attributes that these aspects of God's creation represent are being given to the human relationship between God. And you have the Son of God ushering Ani into the presence of the God symbol and force, Osiris.
Anytime the wish of nature wants you, you leave. So ascension is the highest honor that you could pay to an Egyptian priest, is to say he ascended. He ascended meant that he was one with God, he became one with nature, he was one with the eternal spirit forever. But he meant he was so light that the gravitational pull of the earth could no longer hold him. Enoch was the first one that had that given to him in the Old Testament. 800 years later, another prophet came by the name of Elijah, and the same thing happened to Elijah. Now, all of the work we know as Christians that Jesus Christ did, he healed the sick, he made the lame walk, he cured the blind, he brought the dead back to life. Everything that was attributed to Jesus, Elijah did it 800 years before Jesus. But people never speak of Elijah for doing it. Elijah healed the blind, cured the leopard. Okay? Elijah brought men back from the dead. And Elijah also ascended into heaven.
And this is all 800 years before the...
This is 800 years before Christ. Okay?
How does Melchizedek fit in there? Because the Bible refers to Jesus as after the order of Melchizedek. Was he an Ethiopian priest?
Well, the whole area, see, it's hard to pinpoint whether he was an Ethiopian or Egyptian or Hebrew. The whole area at that time were black African. They were of the same race, but culturally some of them were different. And most of them spoke a language around the time of Melchizedek, which we call today a lingua franca. A lingua franca means a language that common to people with many different languages. In that area, the predominant language of the Babylonian Empire was Aramaic. All of them spoke their own native tongue, whether it was Hebrew or whether it was Phoenician or whether it was Egyptian, but all of them communicated with each other in Aramaic. So Aramaic became the lingua franca from the 6th century BC, from the 8th century BC, all the way down to about 400 years after Christ. So when we speak of Melchizedek, it's pretty hard to pinpoint whether he's an Ethiopian or whether he's a Hebrew or whether he is an Egyptian, because they're all basically the same people.
They were Africans.
They were all Africans.
I see.
Now, the language, and all these are African language. Could you,
Well, Africa had 8 major, well, I would say 5 major ancient languages that passed over to the Western world. The oldest one is Ge'ez. Ge'ez in the Western world is called Classic Ethiopic. Okay? That is the language that most of the men that went into Egypt as shepherds spoke. Now, the word Hebrew is an Egyptian word, but Hebrew simply means nomadic wanderers, pastoral nomadic wanderers who bring their sheep and goat in search of water and grass. So these men had migrated out of Ethiopia along the Blue Nile into the White Nile and began to pitch their tents in cities outside on both banks of the Nile. When the pharaohs saw these men, the pharaohs called them Hebrews, meaning that they were nomadic wanderers, meaning that they were strangers to the land, meaning that these men lived so long as they could find buyers for their sheep and goat. And some of the wealthier ones had camels. One of the men that came about that brought attention to the Egyptians was Abraham. But what they did is told a lie and placed Abraham in Ur in the land of Chaldee. If Abraham was an Ethiopian, and we believe he was, we believe all of the early Hebrews were Ethiopian, then he might have migrated to Chaldee and migrated back, but his seed of stock would have to be around the Blue Nile, because all the Hebrews came from the Blue Nile. And the Egyptians is the ones who gave him the name Hebrew, because the Ethiopians call him Falasha. So a Falasha in Ge'ez and an Hebrew in Egyptian is the same person. Now, if the story is true, and some people say it's a myth that Moses freed the people and allowed them to go into the promised land because God had promised them that, all of the people that went mainly with Moses were people that spoke either Ethiopian or Egyptian. Hebrew itself was not a language until 192 years after Moses died. So when we see Moses coming out of Mount Sinai with 2 stone tablets, written in Hebrew, the Ten Commandments, we know that's a lie because the language didn't exist. How did the Hebrew language come into existence? The Hebrews were people that were nomadic, and they adopted whatever language or whatever land they were in. If they was among the Persians, they spoke Persian. If they were among the Egyptians, they spoke Egyptian. If they were among the Ethiopians of another sort, they spoke Ethiopian. But they had no language of their own. Once Joshua brought down the walls of Jericho, and the Hebrew children went in and claimed the land of Israel, there were three types of people living there: the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, and the Philistines. But they spoke a language at that time that was called Phoenician. The Hebrews were so mad with the Egyptians that they wanted to get rid of the Egyptian language. So what the Hebrews did is they looked at the Phoenician language and found out it was a good language and easy to learn, but there were some words in it, there were some words missing that existed in Ethiopian and Egyptian that didn't exist in the Phoenician language. So they took these few words out of the Egyptian and Ethiopian language and put it into Phoenician and renamed it Hebrew. They had already been called Hebrews themselves, but they had no language. So they stole the language from the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, and called it their own language. So when we run into Hebrew, the first Hebrew scribe that would write anything in Hebrew came about in the year 850 BC. So on my brochure, on Article 1, what I show you in Section A, the original manuscript, 1250 BC, 850 BC, 587 BC, and 150 AD. Now, 850 is the year that the first Hebrew scribes wrote any part of the Bible in which they were translating the Bible from Ethiopian and Egyptian into Hebrew. Those were called Hasidims. They were the first of the Jewish scribes. They came on the scene around 850 BC. The next group of scholars that came on the scene were the Pharisees, then the Sadducees, then the Sanhedrins, then the Essenes. These were men that were translating what they had learned in Egypt and other parts of the world that they had migrated to into the language of the new land. Remember, Joshua fought under Moses. And we've been taught that Moses was just a really holy man, but Moses was a guerrilla fighter. He was a soldier. Moses thought that if he wanted to deliver his people, he would have to take them to Sinai, because Pharaoh's chariots were no good in Sinai. Pharaoh's spears and lances were no good in Sinai. So Moses was the world's first great guerrilla fighter. So now if the story is true of Moses, now some people say it's a myth, but if it's true, what we can see is that Moses led the world's first successful slave revolt and led the world's first national liberation movement. After Moses died on this side of Mount Pisgah, Joshua took the children in. What Joshua had sense enough to do was claim the land. Because if you got a free people and they ain't got no land, they're still technically slaves. We were freed in the South in 1865 with given no land. The end of colonialism in Africa, they weren't given any land. Because one of the things that white people have always realized since the coming of Alexander, said 332 BC, is that all wealth came from two sources, land and labor. And if you have land and you control the fruits of other people's labor and you do not have to pay them for it, they call that slavery. That creates wealth. So with the concept of land and labor, the Europeans brought that into Africa. African people by and large used to look at the land as tribal, that the land belonged to all the people. And if you work on this bank this year, next year you move to the other bank. You see? But the European had developed something called private property. And private property became the forerunner of European thought. Anything the European could do to advance and accumulate private property is what he did. So he spent a lot of money inventing a gun and a printing press. And that gun and printing press made him unopposed master of the planet. He took everybody's land who didn't have no guns and enslaved them and gave them a Bible in his version of it so he could control their mind through his printing press. So when we look at real power, we find out that all power that Whitey have came from the gun. His gun took Indian land, his gun took African labor, his gun took Mexican land, his gun took Asian land, and he was taking lands from people that didn't have no guns.
That's true.
So what we begin to see is the European advanced because he had developed four sets of consciousness that we didn't have. He had a consciousness of land, he had a consciousness of labor, he had a consciousness of the gun, and he had a consciousness of the printing press. So with the consciousness of land, he developed a land hunger, a greed for land. Okay? With the conscience of knowing that everything in the land had to be extracted, he just developed a conscience for the quest of labor. So that meant he needs slaves. But once he got these slaves were rebellious. So what he wanted is to make these slaves more docile and more amicable to slavery. So he gave them the Bible. So the Bible that he gave them was not the Bible that was originally written for them, but a Bible that he had tampered with and changed to serve his own need. Many people think that the Christian Bible is a European Bible. It is not. The Christian Bible is an African Bible that was carried to Europe by Christ's disciples. From after the death, from 50 years after Christ died, all the way up to the 4th century. Peter, Paul, Bartholomew, Matthew, these men crisscrossed Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome, and into Spain carrying the Bible. But they were bringing, at that time, knowledge to the savage. What they were doing was civilizing the heathen. What they were doing was civilizing the pagan. And they were bringing in Christianity from Africa to try to soothe the pagan of Europe. Because Christianity was just getting off the ground in that part of Africa, Northeast Africa, and the Europeans were still worshiping pagan gods and witchcraft. So what we begin to see is that what we call Western civilization, in essence, is rooted in Africa. Western religions is all African origin. Western philosophies are all African origin. I bought a book here since I'm talking about it. When I was a kid, we were taught that all philosophies came from Greece. I found out that the Greeks stole philosophy from the Africans just like the Hebrews stole religion from the Africans. So when we see Greek philosophy, we talk about Socrates and we talk about Aristotle and we talk about Plato, what we should be talking about is the Egyptian priests that they studied at the foot of. Because these men knew nothing until they went to Egypt and studied at the foot of the priests. And they were bound to secrecy. So when they went back to Rome, when they went back to Greece, one of the reasons that Socrates was made to drink the hemlock is because he was bringing in a foreign African ideology. And the king thought he was bringing that ideology there to overthrow him. But what Socrates was trying to do is fight backwardness, heathenism, ignorance. He was trying to bring them up to date of where the Egyptians had already reached. But they misinterpreted and made him drink the hemlock. If he hadn't, it wouldn't have never got off the ground. So when he drank the hemlock, then the other Greeks like Plato and Aristotle began to follow in his footsteps to learn more about Egypt. 300 or 400 years later, the Greeks accepted it.
While you're on that, just to clarify for people, when you say that the religions came out of the Egyptian cosmology, can you give some parallel of the essence of the Bible as we know it and how that relates to the Book of the Dead?
Okay, well, the book that all religions come from is this. This is called the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Book of Going Forth by Day. Okay? This book gives us our first concept of heaven and hell, of salvation, of life, of death. This book put us in touch with the universe. And this book tells us in order for a man to be godly, he must be in harmony with nature. You follow that? Mm-hmm. So the Egyptian religion looked at the sun, Ra, as being the giver of all life to the mother earth, Eb. Everything that's on the earth comes from the earth. But until it's sunlight, nothing can grow. So what happened is the sun gives energy to the earth that give life to plants and animals. We too are animals. Okay? So when we begin to see the Egyptian Book of the Dead, every other Bible in the world is rooted here. Now this book is 3,000 years older than its nearest rival, Bible-wise. Mm-hmm. In other words, the next rival to it would be the Old Testament. This is 3,000 years older than the Old Testament. So when we begin to look at it and we see the story of salvation, the story of ascension, the Trinity, we begin to see the virgin birth. All of these are carbon copies of Egyptian mythology. The whole concept of Christ being born of a virgin is a duplication of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Horus was born from the virgin, Isis, who had no father, who had been dead. Osiris. So we begin to see that the early Christians and the early Hebrews transported Egyptian culture to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem to Europe. So when we look at all of Judaism, all of Hebrewism, it's nothing but a continuation of the culture of the Egyptians. And the Egyptian culture was rooted in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian civilization is older than the Egyptian, but it didn't reach as high a point of development. So what we have to see now is it's time for all of us to go back to the drawing board and relearn our history. We can never trust nobody with our history again but us. Because people have lied, they have falsified our history, they have whitewashed our history. We saw Jesus as a white man, we didn't even recognize him when he was a brother. If he had been a black African, we would know who he was. But once we lost our freedom during the slave trade, they commissioned, the Catholic Church in the rise of modern capitalism in Italy, commissioned a group of artists called the Renaissance. Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Luca della Robbia, to whitewash every character in the old Bible so that it would be acceptable to European tastes. So all of a sudden we got a lost history, a stolen history, a destroyed history, a falsified history, and a tampered with Bible. We got to unlearn 500 years of lies because we've been lied to for 500 years. And on the basis of that, I would say that in every home in America, in every black home in the world, they should have these books: the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Stolen Legacy, the Lost Books of Eden and the Lost Books of the Bible and the Forgotten Books of Eden, the original African Heritage Bible, and the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered. All of these books should be in every black home in America because these books give us back our history. And once we get our history back, we regain our mind. And once we regain our mind, we develop a consciousness for liberation. We develop a land consciousness, a labor consciousness, a national consciousness, a race consciousness, a class consciousness, a caste consciousness, and a gender consciousness. Let me tell you what it means. A land consciousness means we'll develop knowing that all wealth comes from land. A labor consciousness means that we will begin to learn that the fruits of our labor has been making other people rich for the last 500 years. And if we control the fruits of our own labor and have some land of our own, we can produce the things we need, independent of anybody else. Now, for liberation, when I say a race consciousness, we have to learn to put Pan-Africanism into practice. The unification of the African race is what Pan-Africanism is. National liberation is to liberate that oppressed nation, wherever it might be, if African people is in it. Class emancipation means that the whole working class are slaves to those who buy labor. In other words, white people at that point become a class brother. But since we live in a country like the United States, where black people are discriminated in the workforce, we constitute a caste at the bottom of an exploited white working class. And our women are subjected to a notch even below the caste. So we got to fight for the equalization of women, the equalization of gender. We got to fight for the equalization of ourselves within the working class that's oppressed. We got to end national oppression. We got to end colonization, whether it's neo or old. And we got to unify African people, whether they're in the United States, in Africa, in the West Indies, or in South America, or wherever they are, in the Arab world. So we talking Pan-Africanism as a form of consciousness, race consciousness. Not to hate nobody, but to love yourself. You don't have to hate people to love yourself. National liberation, wherever black African nations are oppressed, they should be liberated. But the reason we have to teach this is because you cannot liberate people without taking land. Liberation is impossible without land. Land is the whole essence of liberation. Everything on this earth comes from the land. And it has no value till labor touch it. That camera you have came from the land. Your clothes come from the land. Your food comes from the land. So when we learn that the marriage of land to labor is what gives rise to products, products give rise to profits, profits give rise to wealth, wealth gives rise to power. Now what is power? Power is the ability to define things and make things come about in a desired manner. Okay? So what we are saying is the whole Bible is tied up with the liberation of our people, because this Bible becomes the cement or the glue that bring all of us together for the purpose of national liberation. And we don't want to oppress nobody. We're not into national liberation for oppression, because if it didn't work for white, it's not going to work for us. So we believe that the 21st century will belong to the Africans or people of color, just like the other past 500 centuries belong to Europeans. The pendulum has swung all the way. Now it's on its way back. So what we have to do is understand and seize the time. I believe in my heart it's the task of the African American in particular, and Africans in general, to liberate the whole of mankind. Because we have suffered more than any other race of people on earth. And right now we stand before Western imperialism, just like Moses stood before Pharaoh. We are the chosen people of this age, this epoch, this era. We are chosen to carry civilization further, to a higher level of humanity, where men will really see each other as their brothers, and be their brother's keeper, and do unto others as they'd like to have others do unto them. So we're not talking a hate philosophy. We're talking about a brotherhood of mankind, the establishment of a kingdom of heaven on earth, by being who we are. And as it was in the beginning, so shall it be in the end. And I wasn't there, so I really don't know, but what I can recollect and read between the lines, there's a case that says some people worked in Egypt and didn't get paid. Now these people had a beef with Pharaoh, and they went to the hills or to the desert for 40 years to fight. Now in this 40-year struggle, from what I can read, they made the war so costly that Pharaoh let them go. Now when they left, they went into a new land called Canaan. And this land of Canaan was already inhabited by other African people. But these people who had fought Pharaoh for 40 years had learned to fight so well that the Canaanites were no match for them. So these people was able to take Canaan. Now there's a documented history that there did come a people out of Egypt that took Canaan. That's documented.
And now, these are all African people.
Well, there's nobody else in the world at this time. We are talking about 1250 BC. The first white man to show up in Africa were the Greeks. The first Greeks to show up came in the 7th century BC. This is 500 years before they were in Europe. See, remember, Europe was still in a barbaric state of savagery. Not to put Europeans down. Civilization hadn't reached that part of the world yet. The Africans had 4,500 years of recorded history before there was a pencil in Europe. So what we're saying, we're not saying it mean-spirited. We're not saying it that white people, that was their stage of human development at the time. The first people to come of European origin into Africa were the Greeks. The second group of Europeans to come were the Romans. The Greeks came 500 years before the Romans. The Greeks came in the 7th century and the Romans came in the 2nd century BC.
Now, correct me here. Where does this, the people who call themselves Jewish people, where do they fit into this pattern? Could you address yourself with that?
Yeah, well, one of the hardest things to do is distinguish and to make people understand the difference in Hebrews and Jews. Hebrews are the indigenous people of Africa who never left. Okay? Jews are Hebrews that left after the destruction of Jerusalem. See, Caesar said he was tired of this whole black Hebrew thing. That these people in the province of Judah was wearing up. There was two parts of Israel. There was a country called Canaan. In the north they called it Israel, in the south they called it Judea. The people in the south were called Jews. When Caesar decided to put an end to the Jewish thing in the year 70 AD, he dispersed them and destroyed the whole city and all the temples. They called that the dispersion of the Jews. The Jews took a path north and northwest. They went to live among Turks and Greeks and Cossacks and all of the other people of Europe. And they lived there for 2,000 years. And they married and assimilated with these people. So the white man basically started, believe it or not, as an African. And by his migration from the heartland of Africa so many years and went so many distance and then amalgamated and assimilated with the people of the new land, he lost his blackness. So of the Bible, you got to understand the path of the development of mankind in general. Let's say we're going to let some myths stay with some history. Because most people that deal with the Bible don't know where myths stop and history start. For example, the book of Genesis opens up giving us a concept of creation. And it's given to us by a man who lived 3,200 years ago. What we know now, through carbon-14, that the world is 10 billion years old. And if Moses lived 3,200 years ago, the world was already 10 billion years old when he was living. So what we have to use that is as a way of showing that Moses said what intelligence would lead him to think happen. Some Africans have 4 days to their week. Some Africans have 6 days to their week. The Hebrew Africans had 7 days to their week. Now who knows who's right? But what we do know is that Moses wasn't here in the beginning. The beginning is 10 billion years older than Moses. So what we have to do is let that stop and see it as a form of myth, because we cannot prove that factually. But now history comes about when Moses started writing about other people. Now when he started writing about Joshua, and Joshua was a student under him and learned to fight and become a great general, then we can look at that as a form of history. So we begin to see that all men grew at times of oppression, when they were either fighting kings, or fighting the head of the church, or fighting city-states, or fighting other states. Now, if we look at the life of Christ, we begin to find out that the Romans and the ruling class church at the time is who Christ took on. When we look at Moses, if Moses existed, who did Moses take on? Moses himself was an Egyptian priest. Moses took on the government. Okay? So what we have to say is Moses and Christ were both Egyptian priests. And if they were priests, they had been bound to the secrets of the priesthood. We found out that all of the religious leaders in the world at one time or another had to study in Egypt. Every founder of every religion in the world can be rooted into Egypt. So we begin to see that the Bible grow like all other things. Class struggles. People struggle. The oppressed people struggle against the oppressors. The exploited people struggle against the exploited. The people that are suffering from racism struggle against people that are practicing racism. So we see this as class struggles. So why do classes have to struggle? That is one of the inherited laws of growth. No struggle, no growth. So we see that nature do one thing to give us a peep into how to handle it. Nature make all things in dualisms. The secret of the universe is the law of duality. Everything has an opposite. Nothing is complete without that opposite. The opposite of man is woman. The opposite of up is down. The opposite of cold is hot. The opposite of big is small. Because with this sense of proportion and direction, all time cease to exist. All relativity cease to exist. Everything become one with the spatio-temporal continuum, the whole sea of time, space, and force. So what we begin to unsee is we look dead into the metaphysics of life. And when you look at the metaphysics of life, you see the order of nature, the nature of things, and then you have to be in harmony with nature. And that is, in essence, what the Egyptian religion was about. It was worshiping nature, going to that eternal life by being good, having salvation when you go before the balancing scales, and all that was passed on to the Hebrews, to their culture, and from the Hebrews to the Christians, and from the Christians to the Muslims. But all of it came out of the Egyptian mystic system. So we begin to see that the story of salvation, the story of eternity, the story of heaven and hell, the story of being righteous on this earth, the story of not obeying kings that are mean, all of these things is rooted in Egypt. It was carried into the Old Testament by people who had lived in Egypt 433 years. We only know the Bible through Moses, who was educated as an Egyptian. The Egyptians didn't speak no Hebrew. And Moses and his ancestors lived in Egypt for 433 years. They had to speak one of the four branches of Egyptian. And at the time of Moses, the branch that was used was called Demotic, Demotic Egyptian. But there's four branches: Heretic, Demotic, Archaic, and Coptic. But at the time of Moses, they spoke what they call Demotic Egyptian. So we begin to see that in order to understand the evolution of the Bible or the evolution of history, you got to see that man started life. All humankind from the source of the Nile, the Great Lake area. Mankind as a species came into being there. And he migrated along the banks of this river. And this river had turned that area into a Garden of Eden. They had flush life everywhere. You could spit a watermelon seed out and come back tomorrow and you got a watermelon patch. You didn't even have to plant it. The earth was so black and so rich that it led to an abundance of everything for everybody. So we begin to see man evolving from the Great Lake area and moving northward along the banks of the Nile. Man here evolving here and moving along the banks of the Nile and coming up here to all the great cities. Then we see as the destruction that the Persians and the Hyksos came to destroy Egypt and Ethiopia, they moved across West Africa. And from West Africa down into the South and Central Africa. And as Africa populated, nomads of the sea moved into the South Pacific Islands. And nomads of the desert moved across Asia. And barbarians that still wanted to keep the Aryan ways moved into Europe. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years. So a man who leave Africa 100,000 years ago ain't gonna still be black if he stayed in Europe. If he stayed in Europe for 100,000 years, he'd be white as snow. So when we look and see one white and one black, we don't see no connection. The connection is time, space, and force, and migration, and assimilation. Now we know, it can document that most people that we call European Jews assimilated along the way wherever they went. And they left Africa 2,000 years ago. So if you leave 2,000, me and you, our parents were raped 400 years ago, and me and you came here jet black. Look at us. We're the victims of rape. The Hebrews weren't raped. They assimilated by choice. Maybe some of them were, I don't know. But one of the greatest things they wanted to do is keep the Hebrew out because they hated him. And one of the reasons they hated Christianity so bad, it was a black African religion. And Caesar saw the disciples who were bringing it there, just like the United States government see communists. They come to overthrow our system. So they had to feed them to the lions or throw them to the dogs or to the cats. They saw the Hebrews and the early Christians the same way the United States government see communists. A foreign ideology come to take over and destroy the founding fathers, what our fathers gave us.
Let me ask you, we were talking about, you said the first time that the Europeans came into Egypt was with the Greeks, but who were the Persians and who were the Babylonians, and kind of established that?
Well, see, Babylonians were still Africans. Persian is where the African line becomes Dravidic. Do you follow what that means?
No.
Do you follow what that means?
No.
When you go out of Northeast Africa and leave Egypt, and you start going eastward into Asia, you run into brown people, like Indians. That's called Dravidians. The next human wave, the black man evolved when he left Africa first into the Dravid. As the Dravid moved into Europe, he became white. If you look at an Indian from India and look at a white man from England, they look exactly alike except the color of their skin and the color of their hair. But the characteristics are the same. So we believe that the Dravidians is the direct link of evolution from the African. And we believe that as the Dravidian moved east, the Malay evolved out of him. As the Malay moved north, the Oriental evolved out of him. As the Northern Oriental crossed the Bering Strait, the Indian evolved. Going westward, we believe that directly out of the Dravidian, going into Europe, evolved the European race.
This is interesting because...
well, we're talking about the migrating population of the world.
It's interesting because it's generally believed in some circles that the Hopi Indians in America here are related to the Africans through some yellow people.
Well, let's say it this way. All people on earth is related because we're the father of all people.
Of course.
Okay? But we stayed in Africa and they left. That the ones that left the longest are the lightest, and the ones who left the least are the darkest. And the ones that never left are still black. So we look at all of mankind. The Garden of Eden, if it was here, which is pinpointed here, as man migrated to populate here, when the Persians came in to destroy Egypt, many Egyptians migrated westward across the Sahara, across what they call the Western Sudan. And when the Western Sudan couldn't support them, they moved southward into Gambia, into Ghana, into Ivory Coast, okay? And then as this became overpopulated, they moved into Central Africa and down into Southern Africa, okay? So when we look at man's path of migration, it starts here. The first foreigners that come in to really do harm to the Egyptians were the Assyrians. They were black also, okay? The Assyrians were black. The Assyrians, you might know the Assyrians as Babylonians, but the Assyrians are a mixture of Babylonians and Edomites. That's all they are, okay? Now the Persians, the original Persian, not the white man you see now from Iran, the original Persian looked just like a Tamil Indian. You know what a Tamil Indian look like? A Tamil Indian is a black Indian, not a brown one.
Yes.
Okay? Tamils are black ashy Indians, got straight silk hair. But they're black and ashy, not shiny like most Africans. They got a dark, pale black, okay? So when you look at the original Edomite and you look at the original Persian, they were basically Dravidians. So we see from the African race came the Dravidian, and as the Dravidian moved eastward and southward, he became Malay. And as the Malay began to populate Korea and China and Mongolia, he became Oriental. And if we look at the same path going into the other side of the world on the world map, we'll begin to see that the European, even today, Europeans still call themselves Indo-Europeans. Because their root, and the Germans still call themselves Aryan. You know what Aryan means? Persian, Iran. Okay? But they spell it A instead of I. So the Aryan people, the real Aryan people, were the Persians. And the Persian descendants were the Dravidians. And the Dravidian descendants were the black Africans. So when he talks about how holy and how white he is, if he traces his ancestry back, he got a great black grandfather. Because all humankind have a great grandfather if they're alive on this earth. Well, you start like this. If you want to know where civilization first popped its head up, you'd have to go right here again.